Bacon! Now that I have your attention, this video is about whether or not pork is a healthy food. Hello kindred longevity lifestyle designers, this is Zach here with Secrets of Longevity.com. Bacon, or the cured belly of the swine carcass, as the USDA has chosen to call it, is a very tasty food. Who can't deny the flavor and texture of bacon that's been fried and added as a condiment to salads, put on sandwiches, wrapped around other pieces of meat to increase their succulent flavor. All in all, the number one thing I have to recommend if you're going to be consuming pork products is to consume them nitrate-free. So that goes for virtually all food products in my opinion, but nitrate-free bacon in my opinion is something that you should take caution to as to consuming with that not added to the food. It's perfectly easy for people to sell bacon without this. It's going to look a little browner, so it doesn't have that bright pink look to it. And there's some arguments that people make of nitrates not being harmful. Personally, I get headaches whenever I consume bacon that has nitrates in it, and any other foods for that matter. And it's just in general, to me intuitively, it's a pretty harsh chemical. It has been linked in some studies to gastrointestinal problems, and even though there might be studies that go both ways, it's better to be safe than sorry, and it's just something that doesn't need to be added to these foods. Someone recently asked me whether or not I consider pork to be a health food, or a food that should be included in your diet, either way, whether it's really healthy or not healthy at all, or somewhere in between. And generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with eating a bit of pork, in my opinion. It shouldn't be made a staple food unless you're considering a wild boar type of meat. And that's largely because of the fat content of pork. Largely on a farm-raised animal, pig, even when you start looking at crossbreeds that are closer to the wild ancestor of the pig, wild boar or something somewhere in between, you're going to find a very high concentration of polyunsaturated fats in the fat content of the animal. And despite a lot of pigs being pastured, and the same thing actually goes for chickens, there's going to be a high amount of omega-6 fatty acids found in both pork and chicken meat. That is because they need to have a certain amount of grain in their diet because of how far they've come in terms of their hybridization. They can't subsist on a purely pasture-raised diet. So with chickens they'd be eating grass and bugs, but they, almost all across the board, I've yet to see anyone say that there's 100% pasture-raised chicken eggs, or even chicken meat, because they need some grain or else they get too frail and don't actually grow much. Same thing with pigs. There's going to be better things that the farmer can obviously feed them as opposed to wheat. They could be giving them sprouted barley or sprouted peas, anything that's better than GMO grains, soy, and all these other things that we don't want to have in our diet anyways, so we don't want our animal foods to be consuming those things so that they don't end up in us. Now in terms of the sanitary side of pigs, in terms of bacteria, parasites, I've heard things about pork having higher risk of parasites, etc. Whether or not that's true, I can't say for certain. There's a lot of sort of fake videos out there of like people pouring Coke on pork on YouTube and maggots crawling out of it. If that's even remotely true, then that's obvious that that pork was not a healthy animal, probably in its lifetime. So there's a massive difference between factory farmed meats and the alternative, which is going to be pasture-raised, organic, at least pasture-raised as much as possible, and the pig's getting outside, getting lots of sunlight. One fairly large benefit of pork is you're going to get a very large amount of vitamin D found in the fat. So lard is great to cook with if it's a pasture-raised animal, getting a bit of extra dietary vitamin D that way. I've heard sources saying a pasture-raised pig can have like up to 1,000 IUs per tablespoon. That's a lot. I can't imagine it being that high, and I haven't seen any actual strong evidence for it being that high. But there is some amount, and eating things like bacon, pork chops once in a while, and these other things can be great as long as they're not the dominant meat in your diet if you're eating a higher animal foods diet that's got a lot of meat in it, like paleo type diet. Even better yet is going to be the wild boar, of course, because that animal's out there eating wild foods. It's going to have a better ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 in the polyunsaturated fat content of its body fat. I also want to mention that bacon, for instance, the lard, or lard anywhere on the pig, is around 50% monounsaturated fat, which is the same fat found in olive oil. So it's not bad for your heart by any means. It's actually going to be good in terms of lowering LDL and raising HDL. That's what monounsaturated fat does. Saturated fat, which would be around 35 to 40% of lard or fat on a pig, is going to be raising to both LDL and HDL, but actually lowering to VLDL, which is the one we really want to watch out for. That's the very low density lipoprotein, which is more implicated in heart attack and cardiovascular disease risk than the LDL. We actually need a certain amount of LDL to be healthy, but we don't need VLDL, which is basically the oxidized form of LDL. Carbohydrates raise VLDL but lower LDL and HDL. Polyunsaturated fats lower all three types of lipoproteins, so the HDL, LDL, and VLDL. So what we can see from this is that overall, if we were to consider the monounsaturated fat content of lard, the saturated fat content, and the polyunsaturated fat content, we're going to see most is monounsaturated, next is saturated fat, and then a fairly moderate amount is polyunsaturated fat. But when you compare that to ruminants, ruminants have mostly saturated fat, a bit less monounsaturated fat, and then the polyunsaturated fat is around 5%, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the way the animal is raised. So the important thing to consider is that we evolved largely eating ruminants, grass-grazing animals that had the proper digestive tracts for eating large amounts of greens, and that converted their body tissues to being in this ratio of fats that basically dictates what our needs are in terms of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. So pork, it's a little out of skew, and because of the grains that are needed in most pork products, it's going to be higher in omega-6. So again, looking at the pasture-raised ruminant example, we're looking at about a 4-to-1 ratio, or even between 4-to-1 and 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. It really varies. And then if you look at pork, it's much higher in omega-6, even if it is pasture-raised, and the omega-3s aren't up there. So it's going to bring in those omega-6s in a larger degree, which are inflammatory and have a lot of bad effects on the thyroid and other things like that. So I feel the same way about chicken, really. I'd put pork and chicken in the same category, maybe once or twice a week, tops, in your diet. Some people live on it, they eat it every day because they think red meat's bad, but in reality red meat's much safer in the long run if it's pasture-raised and it's properly butchered and you're eating it in a way that's not aggravating your body in some way. So if you want to get some pasture-raised pork, chicken, beef, or any type of meat that is optimal for your health as opposed to subtracting to your health, you can find it at the links below. That's US Wellness Meats. It's one of the best online stores for pasture-raised animal foods, and there's a lot of other products that they sell in their store. And purchasing through that link gives me a little help with continually putting out these well-researched videos. It's great content. And even if you have gone through the link before, it helps to go through it again if you are making a future purchase, just to renew the cookies that are associated with the affiliate tag there. So with that, let me know in the comments below what you think of pork. You know, there's obviously going to be religious reasons for some people to not eat pork. However, those religious reasons were probably based at some point on observed health effects, and if someone was raising a pig in terrible conditions or was just involved in almost like sewage-like caging, where it was in its own filth, it was eating slop, then that would result in very unhealthy meat. People observe people eating that meat as becoming unhealthy, so then the religious thing comes in, seeing pork as unhealthy. That's just my view. It's not necessarily the only reason why people thought this about pork. But yeah, if you're not religious, then I feel it's fine to consume pork if you're wanting to do that. And with that, take care and embrace life without limits.